Hello, and welcome back to Film Fighter, the channel where we examine the strengths and weaknesses of different film cameras as if they were vintage fighting game characters. In this week's episode, we check out old twin-lens reflex cameras like this Rolleicord II. The goal of this channel is to rate these cameras for use by a photographer today. So why would any modern film photographer want to use a camera that was made nearly 100 years ago? Well, I can't speak for everyone, but for me, part of the fun of using film cameras is that I can experience what it was like for photographers a generation ago. This Rolleicord is among the oldest cameras that I've ever had the pleasure of using. Here's a newspaper ad for that Rolleicord camera from 1937. And it's amazing for me to think that someone could have seen that advertisement and bought this camera during the Great Depression, and then used it to take pictures that could be sent overseas to their family members fighting in World War II. That connection to the past is one of the reasons for this camera's high marks in our first category, collectability. The Rolleicord that I have is a less expensive version of a Rolleiflex 2.8. The Rolleiflex camera was popular for several decades and was famously used by photographers like Lee Miller, a war correspondent during World War II in the 1940s, or Vivian Maier, who shot candid street photos in New York City during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Even legendary portrait photographer Richard Avedon was famous for using his Rolleiflex camera in the 1960s. There's also several non-photographer celebrities who owned or were photographed with a Rolleiflex, including George Harrison of the Beatles, who owned several cameras, Robin Williams, who had this famous portrait taken for a promotion of his film 1 Hour Photo, and Kate Winslet, who played Lee Miller in a biopic named Lee. She got so good with the Rolleiflex camera that her work was put in a gallery right beside Lee Miller's. There's no doubt that the Rolleiflex is one of the most famous and collectible cameras ever. And if that's what we were talking about today, it would easily score a 10 out of 10 in this category. But this isn't a Rolleiflex, it's a Rolleicord. And those last 4 letters make a world of difference when it comes to collector's items. While the Rolleicord was made by the same manufacturer, it was always intended to be a slightly less capable and much less desirable little brother of a camera. And that still holds true today. So I'm scoring the Rolleicord II as a 6.5 out of 10 for collectability. But the fact that it's a less desirable camera than legendary Rolleiflex means that it performs far better in our next category, cost. Now, good condition Rolleiflex 2.8 will sell for around $2,000, even more if it has various other finders or aids that may help to sweeten the deal for collectors. But a Rolleicord like this can be had for much less. This older Rolleicord II is purchased for $150 from a reputable local dealer. And since all of these twin-lens reflex cameras come with their own pair of lenses, we don't need to worry about purchasing lenses on top of that. $150 for camera and lens sounds like a great deal, but we do have to be a bit careful here because these old twin-lens reflex cameras shoot medium format film. Now, medium format film gives you much larger image, but many less images per roll of film. One roll of medium format or 120 film costs about the same as a roll of 35 millimeter. But where you might get 36 exposures on 35 millimeter, these 6x6 square exposures here will get just 12 shots per roll of medium format. So shooting, developing, and scanning 100 photos from this camera will cost just over $200, or more than $2 per shot, if you're using consumer-grade color film like Kodak Gold. The price will go up if you're using more premium films like a Portra, but it could go down if you're shooting and developing your own black and white films. This brings the overall cost for the camera, lens, and 100 shots to $355 all in. That's not a bad price for any camera, and for medium format, it's excellent. But when we compare it to many other less expensive options, it's still going to lose out a little bit. So our score comes in at a 7 out of 10. So far, things are looking pretty good, but this next category is where the Rolleicord really shines. When it comes to reliability, the Rolleicord performs extremely well. This is a 90-year-old camera, but still in excellent shape, and should continue to shoot for a long time to come. The big reason for this reliability comes down to its simplicity. The Rolleicord is an all-mechanical camera with very few moving parts, no batteries, no electronic control. Film is transported by winding this lever, which directly connects to the film spools. Not even springs or gears get in the way. Focusing is achieved by moving this lever, which moves the entire lens assembly in and out in order to achieve focus at different distances. The only potential points of failure are the blades of the leaf shutter here, which is fairly easy to service, and even if it does break, is something that a qualified tech is going to be able to handle quite easily. On top of all of these mechanical advantages, the Rolleicord is made entirely out of metal, which isn't going to get brittle, crack, or shrink over time. And if anything on this camera does break, it's usually very easy to repair. The bottom of the line is this camera was trusted 90 years ago by war photographers for a good reason. And we can still trust it today. It receives a 10 out of 10 for reliability. Now, when it comes to usability, the Rolleicord is a different story. This is an incredibly difficult camera to use if your only experience is coming from a modern DSLR, mirrorless camera, or even an older model SLR camera from the film era. The fact that it has no tech to break down also means it has no tech to help you out. And that process starts to be difficult when we look at loading the film. So let's take a look at how to change the film in this old Rolleicord. The process is more involved than you'd have for a 35mm, and it can be a little bit tricky with this particular model. So the first thing you're going to need to do is open up the camera. On this model, there's just a little spring bent metal that we're going to bend back and then open up the whole back of the camera. You can see the film pressure plate here, which keeps everything pressed firmly to get a nice plane of focus. And then looking through here at the very bottom, we'd find the taking lens, the part that actually accesses the film. You'll notice you can't see the top lens because on the side here there's a mirror at about a 45-degree angle where light comes in through the top lens, the viewing lens, hits the mirror, and then goes up through the viewfinder. Hence a single or a double twin lens reflex. Two lenses and a reflection in order to view what's happening. The piece of film, though, just needs to get stretched across this plane. You might see the camera like this, where it has a film spool at the bottom. To remove the film spool, you just pull on this tab and then twist slightly to keep it open. Take this film spool out and move it to the top. The film will then get stretched from here across the lens and then wind onto a second spool. We can open up this top, again with a twist, pull out and twist to keep that top held open. Take the right end of the spool, press it against the knob that winds the film. Make sure that those are interfacing and then twist until the left knob is holding it, so it's pinched in from both sides. We then need to take our new film and place it in on the bottom. This is just a roll of backing paper from an already shot roll, but it's going to look very much the same. My Ilford film is going to say unexposed in white on the new side. We want the film to go across this way, so I load it in the same way, right side in, and then the left side I twist until it's nice and locked in place. I'll stretch the film across and tuck this tag into a slot on the top side. Once that's accomplished, I can go ahead and wind the film on to the new film spool, being sure that the sides of the film go evenly and nicely onto the next roll. We're going to wind it on until an arrow tells us that we've reached far enough. You'll see this arrow here, and I just like to wind it until the arrow is in line with this bottom roller. Make sure that's nice and tight, and then I'll close this up. Now this particular model can be a bit worrying because we need to use a red window to make sure we're at the right location. If we don't use the red window, we're guessing at where our first frame should go. We might lose out on some frames, or our first couple might be taken not on the film, but just on the backing paper. So I'm going to pull back this little slider to open up a red window. I might use a flashlight or something else to then look at the window, and I'm going to keep winding until I see the number 1 appear. The backing paper on most 120 rolls has a series of arrows. We can see an arrow come into view right here, which tells you to keep going, and then some numbers that tell you how to space the film out. This is more so designed for older things like folding cameras, where you'd always use the red window. On Ilford film, we'll then see these 3 circles and dots, and after that, we'll see the number 1. There's our number 1 in the middle of the window, so I'm going to close the window. On folding cameras, after every shot, you might open the window and then advance until you see a 2, a 3, a 4, but on the Rolleicord, they're a little bit more fancy. Now that I'm on frame 1, I'm going to use this film counter in order to count my frames. To reset it, I take this knob and pull it down and backward, and then while I'm doing that with one finger, I press the knob here, and I can see that I've reset to the number 1. Now I'll go ahead and I'll take a shot. So I charge the shutter, discharge the shutter, and then advance to the next frame. And I just keep turning until it clicks. Once it's clicked, I can't turn anymore. The camera's spaced out the frames properly. I could then take the next exposure and then again push the button in and wind to the next frame. I'd go ahead and do this until all 12 frames are achieved. After my 12th frame is complete, I'll go ahead and wind to the next frame, and my frame counter is going to show me this little circle with a dot in the middle. It's also going to allow me to continue winding without the cam coming in and keeping this fixed. You're going to keep winding for a little while in order to spool the film onto the roll. After a while, you're going to have all of the film then on your top roll. And you can often feel when that's achieved, the resistance will change. It's normally not very far, but since this roll doesn't have the backing paper, it's a little bit off in calibration. At this point, all of the film should be off the bottom spool and onto the top spool. And all of the film should be hidden by that backing paper. Once that's done, I'll go again to the bottom and I'll push up to open the back, and I should see all of my film here. You'll also see on these Ilford films that the color has changed, and it's now not a white film anymore, it's black. This is just a handy feature to let you know that you've finished the roll and this is now exposed. If the film was original, I might lick this side and stick it to the opposite side, or I could use a piece of tape then to cover that up. Then I can take this into a lab or develop it yourself by loading it into a tank and developing that way. So that's how loading and unloading film works. Definitely not the easiest camera to use, but after a little while, you get quite used to it. Now that you have the film all loaded up, you can go out and compose a scene. But be careful, everything in the ground glass is going to show up backwards. Something on the right side of your finder is actually on the left side of your real subject, and you'd have to turn this way. It gets a little confusing, but it's something you can definitely work out over time. After your composition is set up, you're going to need to meter for the scene. And to do that, you need to use an external meter because the camera doesn't have one built in or coupled to any of the actual settings. You could use a more expensive tool like a Sekonic light meter, but that's more expensive than this camera itself. I use a free iPhone app called Light Me, which does a wonderful job for the task. But even here we run into issues. The older Rolleicord uses different shutter speeds before they had been standardized. For example, my light metering app will say 1/60 of a second at f4. Well, my Rolleicord can only do 1/50th of a second at f4. I know that's not too big of a problem at all. Slight overexposure won't be a big issue, for negative films at least. But not everyone's going to know that, and this camera doesn't give you any hints to help out. Another limitation we have here is the shutter speed itself. The Rolleicord only has a top shutter speed of 1/300th of a second, which limits your choice of available apertures. You also need to focus everything manually, which is a bit easier said than done. If you have good eyesight, it should work out well, but if you're someone who uses glasses, focusing might be a little bit more of a challenge, especially since there's no focusing aids on the focusing screen. The closest that we have is a little magnifying loop that pops up to help us get a little bit better image. But there's no split image or rangefinder or other things to help you. All of these steps are very achievable, and evidence suggests that there are photographers who got very, very good with the Rolleicord or Rolleiflex system. You can do it too with practice, but the practice on medium format is expensive, and it may take quite a while before you really feel like this is a comfortable camera. The bottom line here is that the Rolleicord does not score very well in usability. The score here then is a rather poor 2 out of 10. That's not a great showing in this domain. And another challenging category for this camera is its flexibility. The Rolleicord here is a fixed lens camera, which does limit the number and types of photographs that I can try to capture with it. Of the two lenses, only the bottom one actually gives light to the film. This taking lens is a 75mm f3.5, which is roughly equivalent to a 35 to 40mm f1.8 lens on a 35mm camera. But be careful with that. With a different aspect ratio, those terms don't exactly translate one-to-one. So that's more of a general guideline than an absolute comparison. Still, this focal length is moderately wide, and the shallow depth of field I can get with a lens of this sort means it's surprisingly versatile and useful for many different scenarios. I could easily use this for portrait photography or candid street photography, even some landscape photos. But this camera is never going to specialize in any one genre. I won't be able to get amazing blown-out backgrounds on portraits or super wide angles for landscapes. Like most fixed lens cameras, this is a jack of all trades, but a master of none. More problematic, though, the slow operation of this camera. The amount of time it takes to go from frame to frame or to load film once the roll is over makes this a very poor choice for fast-moving things like sports or weddings. Now, that's not to say it's impossible to do with these cameras. Many people for an entire generation shot journalism and weddings and sports all on twin-lens reflex cameras. But they're much more limited in what they can do, and there's a reason everyone transitioned over to SLRs and eventually digital cameras once those became available. It's possible to get amazing photos in any genre with this or any other camera, but there are real limitations to this system. And if you're going to use this instead of a more modern system, you're forced to be far more selective on when you press the button and take the photo. Overall, the Rolleicord is quite limited in its usefulness across genre and scores just a 3 out of 10 for flexibility. The next category we have to evaluate is size. The Rolleicord II is among the smallest 6x6 medium format cameras around. It actually ends up being fairly similar to a fully loaded SLR with an autofocusing lens, like the Nikon N60 that we saw last week. It can be carried around the neck or shoulder, and the weight is relatively comfortable, but certainly noticeable. The Rolleicord is definitely able to be carried without too much of a hiccup. but the boxy shape makes this form far from pocketable. And if we're comparing this to the pantheon of all film cameras, instead of just medium format cameras, we have to acknowledge that the size of this camera is above average. And thus the score is slightly below average, a 4 out of 10. This brings us to our last and arguably most important category, image quality. As a medium format camera, the Rolleicord has a huge advantage in terms of resolution. A 6x6 negative has 4 times more area than the 35mm frame. As a rough guide, we could say that a frame of Kodak Gold 200, a consumer-grade film shot on 35mm, is roughly equivalent to a 12 megapixel resolution. This means that a 6x6 negative would resolve roughly 50 megapixels worth of data. Another advantage of medium format is the apparent reduction in grain size. Because we're looking at a much larger area for the negative, the relatively small flecks of grain become much less apparent in the final image. As an example here, let's have a look at a particularly grainy film, Ilford Delta 3200, a black and white film that I developed in Rodinol, known for its particularly high grain. On a 35mm frame, the grain is very apparent, and frankly, I find it to be unusable to shoot Delta 3200 in 35mm with this developer. But if I use the exact same developer on the exact same film in a 6x6 negative, I end up with this result, which I find to be perfectly acceptable. And I'm happy to shoot higher ISO films on medium format than I ever would on 35mm. The Rolleicord is an inexpensive way to access the benefits of medium format film, but it's not without some drawbacks. The fixed lenses of these early Rolleicords were uncoated and very prone to flaring with loss of contrast if we're shooting directly into the sun. Here's a picture of what this backlit tree looked like in the viewfinder as I took it with my iPhone. And then here's the result on black and white film. We can see the final image has massive lens flare and an almost total loss of contrast despite the image being exposed within guidelines. In another more real-world scenario, we can see a loss of contrast, this time on Portra 400. This was a properly metered scene, and the result is still heavily washed out and very difficult, even with adjustments in post-processing, to try and level the playing field. Still, once you keep this limitation in mind, you can create some solid images. So let's have a look at some of the images I've been able to create with the Rolleicord over the last couple years. Personally, I would say that many of these images are ones I'm not particularly proud of. I have to admit that I struggle to compose in a square format. And since I often use backlighting and heavy bokeh in my digital photographs, I sometimes forget that this camera requires quite a different shooting approach. It's also a little bit easy for me to misfocus and lose sharpness if I'm shooting the lens wide open. The reason I point all this out is just to say, don't look at my images and conclude that this camera is bad. In the right hands, you can make great images with far more detail than a 35mm SLR. But given the technical limits of the fixed, uncoated lenses, especially its poor performance when the sun is close to the frame, I'm giving this just a 5.5 out of 10. So, where does this leave us when rating the camera overall? Let's begin by looking at a radar chart. This camera is almost the polar opposite of the Nikon N60 that we saw earlier. The Rolleicord is utterly reliable and has some great connections to history that make it a good choice for collectors, though not as great as an authentic Rolleiflex camera. But the history and reliability of this simple camera come at the cost of usability and flexibility. I would never recommend a Rolleicord as a first camera. But if you already know how to shoot things in full manual mode, whether that's on a digital camera, a mirrorless camera, or a film SLR, then you may wish to look for new artistic opportunities by shooting medium format. And the Rolleicord is a very economical way to do it that can still get wonderful images which are on par with far more expensive cameras. Now, if you're interested in film cameras that offer a different way to make art than what you currently have, but don't want to go all the way to the very vintage 1930s Rolleicord, there are some other options. You could go with a more modern Rolleicord, like the Rolleicord II camera, that has more modern lenses and lens coatings and will offer potentially better image quality. You could also check out a swarm of Japanese TLRs, such as the Yashica 635, which sells for roughly $200 and will perform quite a bit better than the Rolleicord in some scenarios. Or the Yashica Mat 124G, which again could be had for about $500 and many argue competes quite nicely against the Rolleiflex camera. You could also go with interchangeable lens TLRs, particularly the Mamiya series like the Mamiya C220 or 330 cameras. Those are larger and heavier cameras, but the interchangeable lenses add some flexibility. And the f2.8 standard lens means it competes very well with the 2.8 on the Rolleiflex camera. Of course, you could spring for an authentic Rolleiflex if you want to pony up about $2,000. But if you do, you'll be rewarded with very good resale value down the line. After hearing all of these options, you may still be interested in medium format, but not like the downsides of the TLR camera. If that's the case, you can check out medium format SLRs. This Mamiya 645 camera will be the topic of our next episode. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Film Fighter, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, have a great week, and remember that every camera is a compromise. So go out and take pictures with whatever you have.